There can be, and I think there has for a very long time been a very untrue thing about the heart. A lot of untrue things that are said about the heart. And that is one of them could be that, some people say you should always follow your heart when making decisions. And that's not necessarily true, because our hearts, if they're not well formed, they're filled with a lot of emotions. And if we base our decisions just merely on our emotions, then those decisions will rarely come out as good decisions. But if we have a very well-formed heart, and we have a heart that's conformed to Christ, then it sort of has more meaning, it has more weight to it, and it's able to do things that we would never imagine. And one of my favorite saints, St. Augustine, many of us have probably heard this famous quote by him, when he says, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in you, Lord." He says, our hearts have no rest unless they're resting in somewhere they're supposed to be naturally. And naturally, our hearts must be resting with Christ. And what's at stake if our hearts are not resting in Christ and our hearts are we're allowing them to rot? What's at stake is what Jesus says, out of his heart shall flow rivers of living water. If our hearts are not conformed to Christ, then it would be impossible to have these rivers of living water flowing from our hearts. And as human beings who are created by God, this is required of us, brothers and sisters, to produce good things to come from our hearts. We are not meant to have these very dark, very hardened hearts in our lives. We're meant to have hearts of flesh, as we see in the Old Testament. Our hearts must be hearts of flesh, not be hearts of stone. And the only way to transform, to go from one stage to another with our hearts, is understanding how we must depend on God fully. And our dependence on God requires us to have, obviously, an increase of faith, but also an understanding that when we do depend on God, and when we do turn away from a very darkened heart, then we will be able to have these rivers of living water. So brothers and sisters, during this time where, we're all stuck in our homes, we might feel a sense of despair, a sense of loneliness, and a sense of losing hope. But we're already in this situation, and we're already in this together. So we might as well make the best out of it. And that's a call for all of us to see what ways we're able to transform our hearts. See where our hearts are now. What is the status of our hearts? Do we have a hardened heart, or do we have a heart of flesh?